Hello, my name is Tony Brasunas, and this is Red, White, and Blind, where we break the spells of the mainstream corporate media news narratives and uncover the story behind the story. If you think only Fox News deceives people and distorts the story, or you think only the New York Times or NPR deceive and distort, you will learn a lot on this channel. You might or might not be surprised to find out that both the red and the blue side of the news are full of distortion. One of our goals here at Red, White, and Blind is to analyze instances in the news that demonstrate this. Today, we're talking about Jeffrey Epstein and how he was able to get away with running what can only be called an abominable, disgusting pedophilia rape ring at the very apex of the power structure of the Western world. Let's get started. Picture the scene. A girl named Virginia Roberts folded 8 white towels into stacks, ensuring the seams lined up and the spa's floral logo appeared in the corner. She placed the stacked towels on a polished granite countertop. There were no customers, so she tied her blonde hair into a ponytail and resumed reading where she had left off in an illustrated guide to massage therapy. She found the book fascinating. "I'm only 15, she reminded herself. But she had a goal now, to ascend from mere attendant at the luxurious Mar-a-Lago resort to real professional massage therapist. A woman with pointy black locks of hair appeared. Virginia offered the woman tea as she always did and asked politely whether she had an appointment. The woman didn't have an appointment, but she accepted the tea. With a friendly smile and a proper English accent, the woman asked Virginia several questions about the spa before she asked about all of Virginia's notes in the massage book. With a bashful smile, Virginia shared her goal. The woman told Virginia that her boss was a wealthy man, and as it turned out, he was looking for a massage therapist for his frequent jet trips around the world. He would pay for her training if Virginia showed the right enthusiasm for the job. The woman handed Virginia her card and introduced herself. Her name was Ghislaine Maxwell. It was June 2000, and a 3-year nightmare was about to unfold for Virginia as she followed in the path of dozens, perhaps hundreds or even thousands of young girls who were abused by Jeffrey Epstein. Later that warm summer night, Virginia visited Epstein's Palm Beach mansion, as many of the unfortunate girls did before they accompanied him to Paris, New York, London, and Little St. James, Epstein's private island in the Virgin Islands. The girls were offered as sexual property, escorts, and quote-unquote massage therapists to some of the world's most powerful and wealthy men. Millionaires and billionaires, former presidents and foreign royalty, senators and judges, hedge fund tycoons and Hollywood producers, powerful attorneys and famous actors, chairmen of boards and CEOs of giant conglomerates, they all flew on Epstein's plush private plane. The plane was nicknamed the Lolita Express. Ascending from a resort attendant to a professional massage therapist was not in the cards for Virginia. Shortly after that night, as she tells the story, she was forced to have sex with Prince Andrew of England, famed attorney Alan Dershowitz, and many, many others. Those known to have flown on Epstein's jet many times include Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Donald Trump, and countless others. Now, many of them do deny involvement, and Virginia awaits a true day in court where the truth can be ascertained and these men can be deposed. Dershowitz, for his part, wrote a book attempting to refute the charges called Guilt by Association. And as for Trump, he flew on the Lolita Express many times in the 1990s, but seems to have broken with Epstein in the early 2000s and even kicked him out of his house at one point. Whatever was the case for each of these many powerful men, no legal action was brought against Epstein for years. The first case brought against him occurred in 2005, when a different girl's mother brought charges of sexual assault on behalf of her daughter. Many other victims came forward immediately thereafter, revealing Epstein had been running a pedophilia rape ring since at least 1993. So we're talking 10, 12 years at that point. Local law enforcement amassed a litany of evidence and multiple witnesses. It looked like a slam dunk case. Epstein faced life in prison for sex trafficking. What ensued was one of the saddest chapters in American legal and media history. The FBI stepped in and took over the case from local Florida law enforcement. The federal attorneys heard hours of damaging testimony from the victims themselves and their families, but chose to use a grand jury, which protected Epstein from the most threatening charges. Epstein's powerful attorneys, including Alan Dershowitz, who himself was a frequent traveler on the Lolita Express, secured a highly unusual quote-unquote non-prosecution from U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta. It was a sweetheart deal that required him to plead guilty to one charge at the state level. In exchange, Acosta granted Epstein immunity and canceled an FBI probe into his activities. How is this possible? Acosta later claimed orders had, quote, come from above that were, quote-unquote, above his pay grade. So that was part of how Epstein got away with all of this. But the more important part of how he escaped any semblance of justice, as he ran this disgusting rape ring, literally doing one of the worst things a human being can do, abducting girls and abusing them, is that the corporate mainstream media looked the other way for 20 years. Epstein got away with his heinous, psychopathic crimes for a quarter of a century because none of the watchdogs of the media barked. When that first trial occurred in 2005, national media coverage was nowhere to be found. A New York Magazine piece entitled "Billionaires Are Free" was one of very few national pieces that even mentioned Epstein, and it vindicated him with a shockingly permissive "boys will be boys" attitude. The New York Times ran 2 articles on Epstein across the entirety of 2005 and 2006. Most national outlets ran none. One Times piece flattered Epstein's lavish lifestyle. The other mildly questioned his lenient sentence without delving into the non-prosecution. And that was that. The national media uncharacteristically dropped a story about sex and famous people. Indeed, the media ran away from the matter of a major sex trafficking ring as if from an infectious virus. Epstein served a year of gentle house arrest and had to register as a sex offender following the deal, but 8 years later he was still somehow flying on his personal jet with quote-unquote very young girls to his New Mexico and Paris and private Caribbean island on a weekly basis. It was as if he had never been convicted at all. The media stayed silent. Years later, Virginia finally escaped Epstein's clutches. She married an Australian, took her new husband's name, Gaffrey, and the birth of her daughter prompted her to overcome her shame and speak out. Virginia contacted national news organizations and penned a 139-page expose about her traumatic experiences, which was eventually submitted as evidence against Epstein and Maxwell in court. She also contacted national news organizations, and in 2016, she spoke directly with ABC News host Amy Robach. Robach was intrigued and she took up the story. She arranged a flight to New York for Virginia, and Virginia felt confident enough and comfortable enough to tell Robach the whole horrifying story in person and on the record. Robach recorded it all and spent hours preparing a report on the bombshell revelations. The story would finally expose Epstein for what he had done. ABC News never ran the story. No corporate media channel, Fox, NPR, The Washington Post picked it up either, despite Virginia's dogged efforts. If the main priority of the American news organizations is to generate clicks and views, as many Americans believe, this story was surely a godsend, but they all ignored it. Robach herself recalled in 2019, "I had this interview with Virginia Roberts. We would not put it on the air. First of all, I was told, who is Jeffrey Epstein? No one knows who that is. This is a stupid story. Then the British Palace found out that we had our allegations about Prince Andrew and threatened us a million different ways. We were so afraid we wouldn't be able to interview Kate and Will that we quashed the story. And then Alan Dershowitz was also implicated. She told me everything. She had pictures. She had everything. She was in hiding for 12 years. We convinced her to come out. We convinced her to talk to us. It was unbelievable what we had. Clinton, we had everything. ABC News suppressed the story. Despite Virginia's repeated efforts to tell the world, her story was never heard. This is how Epstein got away with his despicable crimes for another 5 years. Only pervasive complicity, a culture of corruption, could allow this magnitude of criminal behavior to go on this long. It wasn't one bad apple at one news organization or one attorney at one complicit prosecutor's office. This kind of censorship isn't a Democrat or a Republican thing either. It goes far deeper than that, and I hope you see this. Widespread distortion and censorship infect our corporate news media. This is why we are, as I say in my forthcoming book, red, white, and blind. We are all in a state of deception. This deception is composed of 3 thick forms of bias. There's innocent bias, which is bias that comes from a journalist's personal characteristics, life experience, worldview, race, class, gender, etc. Then there's systemic bias, which is bias that comes from the parent corporation for which a journalist works. And finally, there's nefarious bias, which is bias that comes from intelligence agency operations, operatives posing as journalists, and deliberately planted narratives. All 3 kinds of bias contributed to the suppression of this story. This was media censorship, and it prevented the public from learning about Epstein. It prevented justice from being served for decades. Widespread media deception enabled Epstein to perpetrate his heinous crimes with impunity. Robach's story was quashed at ABC News, as she says, but surely it wasn't the only media outlet that suppressed it. We know about it because of a leaked accidental recording, not because Robach came forward. No major print reporters were ever put on the story. Another 2 whole years and countless young girls later, in 2018, a low-level reporter at the Miami Herald named Julie K. Brown finally was allowed to publish a story she had spent years researching. Her piece, entitled "Perversion of Justice," identified nearly 100 girls who had been pulled into the pedophilia rape ring. Brown's piece at long last informed the nation of Epstein's and Maxwell's crimes, and the story exploded into mainstream awareness. It took yet another year, but in 2019 Epstein was finally arrested. The censorship and manipulation of the story continued, though, even after Epstein's arrest. Brown herself acknowledged the censorship and bias. I didn't at the time believe that any media network would have succumbed to pressure to ignore or drop such an important story. I was, however, naive and wrong. There are news organizations that protect powerful people. Indeed, as she says, news organizations have thick biases and protect powerful people. These thick biases concealed Epstein's crimes, and these thick biases are exactly what we here at Red, White, and Blind seek to expose, so that you can interpret the news more clearly. It's interesting to note that blackmail also helped Epstein capture media and law enforcement so that they worked for him rather than against him. Before his trial, Epstein loudly told a reporter that he had dirt on hundreds of powerful men all over the world, hinting at explicit videos. The allegations flew. Who had visited Pedophile Island? Who had been a part of this depraved sex trafficking ring? Few answers appeared in corporate media as the blackmail worked its black magic. Nearly as rapidly as it had exploded on the media scene, the bombshell story was gone. Epstein was killed, or died, or committed suicide in prison, or secretly escaped, and the media moved on quickly from the story, running away from it as if from a ghost. It remains unclear to this day what exactly happened to this bizarrely omnipotent psychopath, and so contradictory are the stories of his death, it's not clear that he is dead. What is clear is that men at the apex of the entire power pyramid of the Western world engaged in repeated sexual assault, sex trafficking, abduction, and statutory rape. It's also clear that this country's most powerful media organizations looked the other way for many years. Ghislaine Maxwell finally faced a court conviction in 2022, but still none of the men who participated in the despicable acts faced an iota of punishment. For the sake of comparison, 10 years earlier, in 2008, when investigations revealed that New York Governor Eliot Spitzer had interacted with prostitutes in an Albany hotel, it became an international news scandal that ran him out of office immediately. It ended his career. What he had done was unbecoming and probably illegal, but it was consensual sex between adults. The Epstein scandal was orders of magnitude larger than the Spitzer story, yet it was on the front pages for a shorter amount of time. This story was manipulated and censored so strongly because of intense systemic bias and nefarious bias. That is how Epstein got away with this. If you know of other reasons the Epstein story was censored or other journalists that followed the story early on but were suppressed, please let us know in the comments below. Of course, the story wasn't censored by all media, only by the corporate mainstream media. The independent, alternative, internet-based media jumped on this story far earlier than the Miami Herald. And that's a sign of what is unfolding today. A new enlightenment brought about by the internet's groundbreaking power to connect people and build trust without an intermediary authority. New channels of truth and trust have been opening for a decade now, and they are coming into their own. The New Enlightenment is a major topic of my forthcoming book, Red, White, and Blind. We will also discuss the New Enlightenment at length in future episodes on this channel. Which reminds me, if you like this content and haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel and pounding that like button, as that will help defeat the algorithms that intend to silence this kind of investigation. That's it for this episode of Red, White, and Blind. Epstein got away with decades of heinous crime because of thick media bias and censorship that goes far beyond the red news and blue news bias that we see every day in corporate media. Call me crazy if you're lazy, but that's how I see it. This is Tony Bersunas, and this has been Red, White, and Blind. I look forward to seeing you next time.